One summer afternoon during the final years of his life, Johannes Brahms was walking along the side of a river with the young Gustav Mahler, whose conducting he admired with an enthusiasm that was matched by the ambivalence he felt towards the junior composer's creative works. Brahms was expounding on one of his favorite subjects, contemporary music and its inevitable doom as a result of young composers' ignorance of the craft embodied in the works of the great masters, a craft that was manifesting itself for a final time in his own music. Suddenly, Mahler mischievously grabbed Brahms' arm and pointed towards the river, exclaiming, "Look, doctor, there goes the last wave." Although the older man's response isn't often related, it's equally revealing. "That's all well and good," he growled, "but the question is whether the wave goes out into the sea or into a swamp." When the 29-year-old Brahms first arrived in Vienna in 1862, the city was in the midst of an economic boom. 5 years earlier, Emperor Franz Joseph had ordered the walls built during the Renaissance to protect the city taken down and replaced by an enormous boulevard circling the old town district that would come to be known as the Ringstrasse, an avenue that would host some of Europe's grandest buildings and artistic monuments. The resulting building spree stimulated commerce throughout the city and expanded middle-class incomes. This prosperity seemed to be yet another confirmation of the rationally based liberal order established in the wake of the Enlightenment, but storm clouds loomed. Vienna was an imperial city, the capital of an empire that spanned more than 270,000 square miles and included ethnic groups speaking 11 different major languages. Its decline began with Austria's humiliating defeat in the 7-week Austro-Prussian War of 1866 and the completion of Germany's unification under Bismarck 5 years later, which shifted the balance of power northwards. An 1867 compromise that resulted in the creation of the ill-fated Austro-Hungarian Empire superficially maintained Austria's status as a great power, but the establishment of a separate Hungarian parliament that could make and enforce its own laws was a clear signal that Austria was no longer strong enough to fully restrain long-suppressed Hungarian national aspirations. Such compromises were a feature of Franz Josef's 68-year reign. An unimaginative bureaucrat with a fondness for ceremony and an unshakable belief in the divine right of kings, he was prone to making political accommodations that would preserve the monarchy, but were largely ineffective in addressing the most potent issues roiling his empire, which included the effects of a long economic depression during the 1870s, increasing industrialization and urbanization, deepening racial, ethnic, and class resentments, worker unrest, rising German nationalism, and widespread movements of ethnic self-determination. Late 19th century Vienna exemplified the essential decadence of Franz Josef's tenure. It was a place in which displays of classical beauty, high culture, and civility masked deep-seated bigotries, rampant cynicism, hostile factionalism, and a particularly virulent form of anti-Semitism. While the city's artists were well aware of the rot that was eating away at the culture's structural foundations, their prescriptions tended to reflect generational differences. Predictably, younger artists embraced a spirit of revolt. In his book Fin de siècle Vienna, the cultural historian Karl Schorsky describes the outlook of this group, which came to be known as Die Jungen. These new culture makers defined themselves in terms of a collective Oedipal revolt against the authority of the paternal culture that was their inheritance. They assaulted the value system of the classical liberalism within which they had been raised and criticized this rationalistic legacy from all fields of cultural activity. Although Brahms was keenly aware of the inertia and corruption that was eroding Viennese culture, he saw these new artistic developments as a manifestation of an approaching barbarism, a rejection of the principles that had yielded the greatest achievements in the history of art and civilization. Among Brahms' 4 symphonies, the third is the work that most vividly captures his response to the disintegration of the grand traditions that had sustained European culture for centuries. While the 4th symphony rages against the dying of the light, the third, written during the summer of 1883, expresses a sense of profound nostalgia and resignation. Although the writing often communicates the aspirational tone that had come to typify the genre after Beethoven, what's notable about the symphony is the extent to which this heroic spirit is left unfulfilled. world. While its opening pair of powerful introductory chords and the Olympian theme that follows suggest a continuation of the grand style that had characterized the two symphonies Brahms had written during the previous decade, when they appear again at the end of the first movement, they are presented within a muted autumnal context that brings the movement to a close on a note of quietly exalted acquiescence. This more intimate compositional voice, which Brahms usually reserved for his chamber music and songs, defines the work's essential character and can be heard in the opening movement's gentle, waltz-like second theme, the church hymn that begins the second movement with an evocation of a parlor pump organ, and the melancholy waltz-minuet hybrid that replaces the usual scherzo. The most striking expression of this symphony's wistful thesis occurs in the fourth movement, which is otherwise dominated by the atmosphere of epic struggle that is the predicate for fulfilling the darkness-to-light dramatic template Brahms had inherited from Beethoven and employed in his first symphony. And yet the battle never yields its expected reward. Instead, the coiled energy of this finale suddenly dissipates at the outset of the coda, and we are gradually led back to the resigned, evanescent ambiance that closed the first movement. While Brahms the artist was an idealist, his awareness of the tragic nature of human existence was unflinching. He fully understood that the world of classical beauty he so treasured was fading.